In the early 1900s, a landlord needed to go into the garage of his beloved tenant who had tragically just been conscripted into World War I. What he would go on to accidentally stumble on in the garage would lead to the discovery of some of the most horrific crimes in recorded history. This is that horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. One day in 1916, Martin Krasinski threw on his coat and hat and hurried out the door of his home. He was a landlord and he owned a property at 9 Kossuth Street in the district of Cinkota, just outside Budapest, Hungary, and he was in an eager mood. His tenant, Bela Kiss, who had rented from him since the early 1900s, had just allowed his lease to expire, and Martin wanted to get the place renovated and spruced up so he could get it rented out to a new tenant. When he arrived at the house, he ran into one of Bela's neighbors, who was an old associate of Martin's, and that's when the landlord learned that Bela had been called off to join the Austro-Hungarian army in 1914 as World War I was getting underway. This was a disappointment for Martin as he had to essentially evict Bela. Everyone in the neighborhood loved the tenant and his experiences with him were nothing but pleasant, and in fact, anyone would be hard-pressed to find someone who could say anything bad about Bela. But even still, the property was now just sitting there costing Martin money instead of making it for him, so he had little choice in the matter. So along with Bela's neighbor, Martin went to a storeroom next to a workshop on the property in search of materials they could use for any repairs the house might need. When they walked in, however, they were taken aback by 3-foot tall by 2-foot wide metal drums that were stacked on top of each other against a wall. This was kind of a curious find. Bela was an accomplished, self-taught tinsman who owned his own business, so it seemed sort of odd that he would have large metal drums of chemicals not used for his work. The two men were obviously curious about them, and with the lease on the property up, Martin considered that the drums were now his. He then climbed on top of the bottom set of barrels and used his fingertips to try to pry open one of the lids, but realized that the airtight top had been soldered on with lead. Bela's neighbor then handed Martin an axe and he began chopping away at the seal. And the moment the lid was opened in the slightest, the entire room was filled with an awful stench. Bela's neighbor just so happened to be a physicist and knew immediately what the smell was. It was the unmistakable odor of methanol, more commonly known as wood alcohol. But then, in addition to that, it was mixed with the smell of rotting. The two men then looked at each other for a moment before Martin resumed chopping at the soldering that was holding the rest of the lid tightly against the drum. When he was finally able to flip it open and look inside, he saw that it was indeed full of methanol. He also noticed that there was a bag inside. He then pulled it out, but nothing could have prepared either of them for what was inside. Upon opening this bag, Martin then found long brown hair and the well-preserved body of a woman. And next to her was a length of rope that was clearly used to end her life. As the men stood there quietly, taking in what they were seeing, Martin then moved onto another barrel and started chopping away at that lid. Inside the next one, all he needed was a glimpse of blonde hair before dropping the axe and hurrying to a neighbor's house to call police. This would lead to Detective Charles Nagy being alerted of the find, and then he grabbed several of his best colleagues before making his way out to the city. When they pulled up to the house, they saw the landlord rushing out to greet them, almost in a panic about what he had discovered. And simultaneously also coming out to meet them was a woman named Mrs. Jakubec, who had been Bela's housekeeper since the early 1900s when he moved in. Mrs. Jakubec was a much older woman who was sort of a peasant who lived nearby with her husband, and it would turn out that she was fiercely loyal to Bela, who had treated her with nothing but respect and kindness during her tenure. So when she saw the growing police presence outside of Bela's rented home, she came out shouting at them to leave. But obviously, with what Martin found inside the storeroom, that wasn't about to happen anytime soon. Detective Charles then cordoned off the scene and began looking around the room with all the barrels with other officers and detectives. As this was going on, one of the officers on the scene approached Charles and told him that he had actually been called out to the property sometime in the past because someone had reported the barrels. When asked what he had discovered, the officer said that he had spoken to Bela, who said that he was storing up gasoline for what was certain to be a shortage with the impending war. This seemed like a fairly reasonable explanation at the time. However, what was actually found inside the other barrels were the bodies of 5 others, each of them partially clothed or nude, and all of them with a rope encased with them. A further investigation into the entire property was also done, and out back, police discovered more bodies, all of which were also buried in bags filled with the methanol preservative, which is known to slow decomposition. When it was all said and done, with the property turned into a yard of dirt piles, 24 total bodies have been uncovered. In fact, some recorded reports even put that number at 30, but most sources agreed that the more accurate number was 24. Upon making this horrific find, Charles knew immediately that they were dealing with one of the most accomplished killers in recorded history. At the same time though, none of this was adding up to anyone in and around the rented house. In talking to the neighbors, Charles and the other officers learned more about Bela and were stunned to find that everyone who knew him thought so highly of him. Charles expected that he might learn of a reclusive, creepy man who minded his own business, but that was anything but the case. So who was the real Bela Kiss? Born in 1877 in Austria-Hungary, Bela's early life is a bit of a mystery, but around 1900 he began teaching himself the trade of tinsmithing. This involves using tin and other light metals and making and repairing items like pitchers, stovepipes, and needle cases, among many others. By all accounts as well, Bela was a cultured and intelligent man despite having no formal schooling. He apparently also impressed others with his charisma and ability to carry on well-thought-out conversations regardless of the subject with everyone from the poorest to the most educated. More than anything though, he was known as one of the most eligible bachelors in and around Budapest with a handsome face, bright blue eyes, and well-groomed blonde hair. He was sort of the man that women want to be with and men wanted to be, and the married men of the city were said to be jealous of his attributes and characteristics. But with all of that said, Charles knew that despite all the claims from those who knew him or knew of him, there was clearly a part of the tenant's life that he kept hidden from everyone, or at least almost everyone. This is where his suspicion grew of Mrs. Jakobetch. But first, immediately after the discovery of all the bodies, the first thing Charles did was contact the Austro-Hungarian army and ask that if Bela was still on the front lines of the war, he was to be arrested at once. It took less than an hour for the army to start to search for him, but finding him was going to be much more difficult than Charles bargained for. For one thing, the Austro-Hungarian army was disorganized and spread out, fighting in various theaters of World War I. And for another, the name Bela Kiss in Austro-Hungary was akin to the name John Smith in North America, and so it was extremely common. But either way, in addition to getting the army involved, Charles contacted the postal service and ordered that all mail addressed to Bela be sent to the police. If Bela happened to have accomplices that could tip him off of what was going on back home, Charles wanted to cut off that possibility. And finally, while the army performed its search and the postal service started to gather Bela's mail, Charles detained and interrogated Mrs. Jakobetch. Now, in his mind, there was no way that she could have been completely oblivious to what was going on in and around the house. She spent long days there and had a somewhat close relationship with her boss, so Charles had one of his officers sit the housekeeper down in the kitchen, and the moment Charles approached her when she was ready to talk, she flew into a panic, begging him not to throw her in prison. She didn't know that Charles had no intention of doing anything of the sorts just yet, but it seemed that his presence greatly unsettled her. But either way, once she calmed down, Charles started to take down her story. And according to her statement, she had been his housekeeper since Bela was 23, and just like the neighbors told police, she found him to be kind, gentle, and generous. She even told Charles a story about a time when a neighboring dog broke its leg and Bela made a splint for the animal before nursing it back to health. Surely, the kind of man who would do something like that couldn't be responsible for the deaths of 24 people, and she insisted that someone else had to be behind the numerous bodies found on the property. During the conversation as well, one of the more interesting things that Charles picked up on while interviewing her was that it was not uncommon for Bela to host many different women at his home. From that point onward, Charles just sort of assumed that that's how Bela chose his victims. After his first round of interviewing Mrs. Jakobetch, Charles began a search of the house, including Bela's bedroom. Strangely though, there was nothing of interest anywhere. Mrs. Jakobetch kept a tidy house for Bela even in his long absence, but this only served to cast more suspicion on her as a potential accomplice. However, Mrs. Jakobetch also told Charles that she did see Bela with new women all the time, but she was never introduced to any of them and she never asked her boss about them either. As this was going on, when Charles came across a locked door inside the house, he inquired about it with the housekeeper, who told him that of all of the rooms, Bela forbade Mrs. Jakobetch from entering that one or allowing anyone else inside it. Obviously, immediately, this was of great interest to Charles, so he demanded Mrs. Jakobetch open it. She then reached into her apron and pulled out a key that she claimed to have never used before. Charles then took it from her, put it in the lock, and turned the doorknob. When he opened the door, the first thing Charles noticed was that the exterior of the room was completely lined with bookcases, and each of them were filled to the brim with books. Upon closer inspection, however, Charles noticed that most of the content of these books had to do with poisons and various methods of strangulation. Then, other than the bookshelves, the only furniture was a desk and a chair directly in the middle of the room. As Charles started to rummage through the desk, a clear picture of what exactly Bela had been up to started to emerge. Inside one of the drawers were 74 different packets, and each of these contained multiple letters, and each of these packets belonged to a different person. As Charles skimmed the documents, several facts came to light. What he discovered was that all the letters were written by women who had been responding to want ads Bela had continually been running in newspapers claiming to be seeking marriage. The earliest letters were written in 1903, meaning that he had been keeping up with these communications for more than a decade. The ads he was paying to have published also specifically called for women of great financial means, and as he established further communication with these women, he sought to determine whether or not the women had family nearby, Or in other words, would anyone notice if they suddenly disappeared? And lastly, it became clear that Bela had been successfully defrauding the women out of large sums of money. Among the documents Charles found in Bela's desk was also his will, and interestingly, there was a particular person who would receive a large amount of money in the event of his passing. That would have been none other than Mrs. Jakubich, and Charles used this to turn up the pressure on her. He then shoved the will in front of her and loudly accused her of having information about the murders that she was withholding because of her inclusion in the will. But she just as loudly denied knowing anything about her being named an heir. And interestingly, before long, Charles started to find the old housekeeper credible in her denials, and he dropped Mrs. Jakubich from his list of persons of interest in the case. As the dust began to settle, more and more gruesome information became available to detectives. It was learned that of the 24 victims, 23 were women and 1 was a male, although where the man came from was never explained. It was also found that all the victims had died in the same way, which was by rope or wire around the neck. What truly chilled detectives, though, was that each of the victims was also found to have puncture wounds on their necks as if they were attacked by a mythical vampire. And oddly enough, each of the victims also seemed to have been drained of their blood too. And as it turned out, Bela thought of himself as a bit of a psychic and even included this information in some of his ads. Additionally, he made it known that he was a fan of the occult and occult practices, which in addition to the neck wounds and the lack of blood in the victims, caused rumors to swirl that he was practicing vampirism. And simultaneously, as the more disturbing information was being learned, the case took a truly sad turn as Charles focused in on identifying the bodies. This included documents found in Bela's desk, which included a photo album that helped in the identification process. One of the victims had the initials MT embroidered on a handkerchief, and another had the letters KV sewn onto clothing that she was found in. The latter turned out to be a woman named Catherine Varga, whose correspondence with Bela revealed that she had fallen completely and madly in love with him and even sold her very profitable dressmaking shop in Budapest to be with him in Cincoda. And of course, her business made her a wealthy woman, but she had few friends and family who would miss her when she was gone, which also made her the perfect victim for Bela. Another woman found among the bodies at Bela's house was identified as Julianne Paszek. When Charles cross-checked the name with police records, he discovered that she had actually filed a lawsuit against Bela for defrauding her out of money that was supposed to go toward their getting married, which never happened. However, Julianne never did show up for the court hearing, so the case was thrown out. And obviously, no one could have known that this was because she had already passed away. In the days following the discovery of the crimes, word spread across the country and family members of missing women started to come forward. Charles then met with a woman who claimed that her daughter, Margaret Toth, was working in Budapest when she responded to one of Bela's newspaper ads. As the two got to know each other, Margaret introduced Bela to her mother, and Bela took the occasion to extort money from Margaret's mother on the promise that the two would be married. When this didn't happen, Margaret's mother found Bela and confronted him, but he had an awfully convenient story. According to him, Margaret wanted to delay the marriage after she had gotten angry at Bela and suddenly departed Austria-Hungary for the United States. However, Charles determined that what really happened was that Bela and Margaret met in 1906, and while at his house one day, he forced her to write a letter that said Bela had rejected her, and so she was running away to America. When the letter was finished, Bela promptly killed Margaret and shoved her into a metal drum filled with methanol before addressing the letter to Margaret's mother and putting it in the mail. Police learned that he'd received 174 marriage proposals as a result of his newspaper ads. Of those, he accepted proposals from 74 of them, and of the 74, at least 20 would eventually come to be with him. And unfortunately, all of them would end up dead and either pickled in his storeroom or beneath the dirt in his yard. As the case unfolded for Charles, the pressure was on to find Bela, but the entire search for him was made more difficult by rumors and the war. There was reason to believe that Bela was either killed in the war or had been taken prisoner during battle, but the truth of his whereabouts eluded both Charles as well as the very army he was serving. Then, on October 4th, 1916, Charles received 2 different messages from a Serbian hospital. The first claimed that Bela had been a patient there the year before and had succumbed to typhoid. This would have been completely crushing news if not for the second message, which stated that Bela was currently under their care in the hospital. The mixed messages were obviously confusing, but Charles immediately set off for the hospital in Serbia. When he arrived, he was met by Austro-Hungarian army officials, one of which reached out and shook Charles's hand, congratulating him on capturing his man. This was a moment of elation for Charles, who had tirelessly worked the case to bring Bela to justice for what he had done. He was then led to the room where Bela was recuperating, and there in the bed was clearly a man. Charles then exhaled and walked into the room. When he began speaking, there was no response from the man in the bed. This went on for some time until Charles noticed that Bela hadn't moved a muscle since he came into the room. He then put his hand on Bela's shoulder and pulled at it, causing the man to flop onto his back. This is when he realized the man in the bed was dead and it was not Bela. It seemed that somebody had tipped the killer off and he had made an escape from the hospital after putting the body of a dead patient into his bed. This was the closest Charles would ever get to the man he so desperately sought. In subsequent years, the question of where Bela was went unanswered, but not without reports of sightings in various places. In 1919, he was reportedly spotted in Budapest. Then a year later, a report came in from the French Foreign Legion about a soldier going by the name Hoffman. This was an alias Bela was known to use in his newspaper ads, but then in addition to that, this soldier apparently said that he was proficient in the very same method Bela used to get rid of his victims. And not only was the name intriguing, but when asked to describe the man who told him this, the Legion described Bela almost exactly. Unfortunately though, before police could find this man named Hoffman, he deserted the Legion and went missing. Some of the more convincing later sightings were reported in America of all places. A homicide detective named Henry Oswald was in Times Square in New York City when he swears he spotted Bela exiting a subway station. It might seem like this was little more than a case of mistaken identity, but Henry's nickname among the police force was Camera Eye, supposedly for his unmistakable memory when it came to remembering faces. Unfortunately though, Henry saw the man at a time when Times Square was packed and he lost him in the crowd. A final report from New York City made its way to Budapest in 1936 when a man fitting Bela's description and heritage began a job as a janitor. He was apparently renting an apartment in the city, but when police arrived there to meet the man, he had already vacated the apartment and ran off, never to be seen again. Today, Bela Kiss has become known as the Monster of Cincotta, and where he went and what happened to him still remains a mystery to this day. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a member here on YouTube. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. And hopefully, I will see you in the next one.